Protests in Kazakhstan, sparked by anger over rising fuel prices, have intensified this week. The president has ordered security forces to shoot without warning. He's declaring victory and putting down demonstrations with the assistance of Russian troops. So far, dozens have been killed and hundreds wounded. It's the most serious challenge to Kazakhstan's leadership since independence in 1991. Joining us now to explain the events and why they matter is Melinda Haring, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Melinda, welcome back to Quicktake. So it didn't take long for peaceful protests to metastasize into general discontent against the government, turning violent in the process. Explain how this all unfolded.
Hi, Scarlett. Happy New Year. Yes, you got it exactly right. So the proximate cause is a spike in the price of liquefied petroleum gas. Most cars in Kazakhstan run on LPG rather than gasoline, but because there were artificial price caps. And those caps were lifted on January 1st. On January 2nd, last weekend, we saw protests that began in Western Kazakhstan. And those protests were real and legitimate. People were protesting about inequality, inflation, and a lack of political freedom. And those protests spread across the country. And we see really chaotic scenes. We see buildings on fire. We see airports closed. We see lots and lots of weapons everywhere. But it's important to distinguish between the legitimate protesters and then there's a lot of looting. And a lot of that looting is being done in Almaty, the biggest city down in eastern Kazakhstan. But this story is not about the spike in liquefied petroleum gas. It's a lot bigger than that. This story is ultimately about power. So Nazarbayev left power in 2019. And when he left, Scarlett, he had one condition. He wanted his stolen assets to be protected. But there was a problem. The elites didn't figure out how to divvy up power, which left the new president, Nazarbayev handpicked him, his name is Tokayev. It left him in a really weak position. So as protests spiraled out of control, Tokayev didn't really have another choice. He had to call in those Russian troops because he did not have the backing of the security services or the Kazakh military.
Interesting.
So that's why this is such a big deal.
You mentioned that there have been two leaders, and of course, there's only been two leaders since the nation turned independent. How would you compare the level of corruption, cronyism in Kazakhstan versus other countries in the region?
It's high. Kazakhstan is a wealthy. It's a very wealthy country because of its natural resources, and corruption is very high. RFERL, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, has done some excellent exposés into the corruption surrounding Nazarbayev and his regime, and people knew about it, right? So that's part of the real legitimate anger that we're seeing. But so there was a legitimate protest movement that got out of control. But I think it's at this point, a lot is not known because the internet keeps going in and out and people can't freely go in and out of the country right now. But if you have to ask me to summarize what's happening, it looks like it's a coup by Tokayev against Nazarbayev. It looks like this is the end of the Nazarbayev era in Kazakhstan. There are reports that the Nazarbayev family has fled Kazakhstan. We don't know if those are true or not, but that's definitely something to watch. Tokayev had to call in Russia to bring forces in, the Collective Security and Treaty Organization. They've never deployed forces before. And this is a complete change in Kazakhstan's foreign policy. They had something called a multi-vector foreign policy. They were always trying to balance interests. Right. But now they're going to be very reliant on Russia as a result of this.
So it's clear why Kazakhstan and why Tokayev called in Russia. But what does Russia get out of lending military support to quash these protests inside of Kazakhstan?
It's a great day for Moscow, honestly. Moscow doesn't like instability, but they came out on top as far as it looks now. So what it did is it told Kazakhstan's security services to get behind Tokayev, that Tokayev has Moscow's backing. And it also allows Moscow to prop up a leader who's domestically unpopular and it's cheap, while reinforcing the point to all of the neighbors that if they step out of line, that they're next. But it says something even, I think, more sinister and creepy. It says that Moscow has a weak guy in charge who owes them. I don't think they're going to call in the favor right away, but he owes them.
Right. It's a check that they can cash later on. China, of course, also has a strategic interest here in Kazakhstan because they share a border and they're important trading partners because of China's One Belt, One Road infrastructure initiative. Chinese President Xi Jinping actually warned It opposes any opposing forces, foreign forces that are plotting color revolution. Who do you think Xi Jinping is referring to here?
So it's a weird quote, right? Yesterday, in one of the major Moscow papers, the Russians said that they had put together a color revolution in order to distract from the major security talks between Russia and the West. So Moscow is very good at saying there's a hidden hand. Yesterday, Moscow blamed the State Department for the unrest in Kazakhstan. China is basically saying, it's signaling by making this statement that it's A-okay with what Moscow's doing in Kazakhstan. Moscow provides the muscle, the forces on the ground, and Beijing provides the capital. And this is a really, I think, a scary formula that could be repeated elsewhere. So this is definitely something to watch.
That is really interesting, the way you framed that. Russia and
How worried should I be about inflation as a retail investor?
This is Trillions ETF MasterChef, where we
and what's going on there, the unrest there, complicating the upcoming upcoming U.S.-Russia talks, which reportedly won't even touch on the issue of Ukraine because it's too divisive and too complicated.
So analysts are sort of split on this one. Some people think that Kazakhstan will not impact the negotiations next week. I, for one, think that the Russians see the situation in Kazakhstan is very acute, and they need to get stability. So their priority right now is to get stability. But I do think the Russians are annoyed that this unrest bubbled up right as they were trying to force the West into making great concessions over Ukraine. But I think the talks next week are not just about Ukraine. It's much bigger than that. Putin has bigger ambitions. At this point, it looks like Putin probably has come out on top in Kazakhstan. He's strengthened his hand, and that's part of his policy. But right now, he's trying to use Ukraine as a lever to rewrite the European security architecture, and he's pushing and pushing. Yeah. Yesterday, his diplomats were saying, "We want a response to our demands now." So they're unlikely to be willing to engage in long, protracted diplomatic negotiations.
It's always the long game for Putin and Russia. Melinda, if you could connect the dots for us between Kazakhstan and some of the other former Russian satellite states. We've talked to you in the past about other countries like Belarusia, which is also ruled by an authoritarian leader that still very much relies on Russia when there's a crisis brewing. What's the through line there?
The through line is Russia. Russia has interfered in Kazakhstan, in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Armenia. Right in the past couple of years, Russia sees all of these countries as part of its sphere of influence, and it is willing to put troops on the ground. It's willing to use information operations. It's willing to use all sorts of means to maintain these countries as part of its orbit. It's saying these countries are ours and get lost west.
Okay, so bottom line, what does this mean for the U.S. and how much sway, influence Washington actually has on any of the events that are unfolding?
So in Kazakhstan, the U.S. is a player. The unrest in Kazakhstan is important because it brings together Chinese, Russian, American, and European interests. So if you look at the investment figures in Kazakhstan, the number one investor is the Netherlands. Number two is the United States at $2.24 billion. The U.S. has a lot, private business has a lot invested in Kazakhstan. China and Russia are the major trading partners in Kazakhstan. So that's why Kazakhstan is a really significant country.
Melinda Haring, thank you so much for getting us up to speed on what's going on in Kazakhstan. We'll check in with you when there's more to discuss. Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Appreciate it.